Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1917 diary series, and I'm trying to block the sun. If I move even a little, you see what happens, so I'll try to stay right here in the middle. I waited too long today. It's 4:30 in the afternoon, October 7th, 2025, and our recap. Well, yesterday was just kind of a preparatory video to give you some background on Dmitri and how he ended up where he did at the English mission in Tehran/Gulhek, Persia. In September, they were still, the mission or the legation was still in its summer accommodation. Okay, so things to note in this long diary entry and in the 1917 diary entries in general. Well, if you watched the 1938 diary series, then you know that Dmitri made a claim to the press in December 1938 that he had fought in against the Turks in the Caucasus, and that he'd fought with the British, and then that when he had been assigned to fight against the Red troops, that he had said no because he wouldn't bear arms against his countrymen. So yeah, none of that was true. Another thing that wasn't true was the stories that apparently he told, although one was related to Paul Elinsky by his mother, Dmitri's ex-wife, that Dmitri returned to Russia at some point secretly during this period before he went back to managed to make it to France and England. That he returned to Russia and entered his palace in disguise and reclaimed some of his property. And, you know, as heroic as that story may sound, if he'd actually done that, and he absolutely did not, it would have been horrifying to think that he'd gone and had done nothing about his father's situation if he had successfully snuck into Russia in disguise. But anyway, that never happened, and I don't know if he told that story himself or not. But Paul Elinsky was the one who brought it up to me and asked me about it, and I said, well, you know, we're going through the diaries, so, you know, I can show you. We can go diary entry to diary entry, and I can show you that that didn't happen. And he said, oh, no, you know, he always thought it was somewhat spurious anyway, although it did make it into Dmitri's New York Times obituary. Okay, anyway, enough about that. I could talk about Dmitri's time in Persia all night without ever reading a single diary entry, because I find it one of the more fascinating sections in the diaries. So here we go. I'm going to repeat the one paragraph that I read yesterday and go on from there. This is the long diary entry of the 16th of September. I am starting a new journal, my 5th so far this year, and the 5th of my Persian exile. God alone knows how long I'll have to stay in this wretched land. When will I manage to get back to Russia to see my friends and dear ones, from whom I've been cut off for almost 9 months now? It seems that never before today have I had to write my entries with such a sense of uncertainty about the future. Usually when I start a new book, it's easy to guess what will happen over the course of 2 or 3 months. In the past, whenever I've had to start a new book here in Persia, I've at least had the consolation of being able to guess what my life would be like when I finished. It's true that in the last 2 books I was cruelly mistaken, because I thought that by September we would see big, important events that would forcefully extricate us Russians and our long-suffering homeland from that chaos and horror in which we find ourselves at present. But alas, that's not what happened. Then, beginning book number 4, I was almost certain that by its end I would no longer be in Persia, and for the past month this thought has not only gained strength, but led to a burning desire to return to Russia in short order, and but for the categorical and repeated advice of Yusupov, I would have abandoned my peaceful and comfortable life in Gulhek with the Marlings, and thrown myself headfirst into the Russian reality, which here, far removed from everything, seems somehow impossible and unreal. Okay, I will actually go forward. Those were my thoughts when I started my 4th book at the end of May in this evil year 1917. Now things are completely different. I have a weird feeling this time. I don't have any hint, any suggestion of what will become of me or what I will have to write at the end of this book. What events will find their way into these pages? Clearly, by the time there are only a few empty pages left in this book, it will already be November, and events are unfolding with such incredible rapidity that God only knows what will be happening then. Will I still be in Tehran, or will I be on the Persian front with one of the regiments of Baratov's corps? Or will I finally simply be back in Petrograd? It's all so dark that I prefer not even to think about it, but to live exclusively for today without thinking about tomorrow. The more so because my life is surprisingly peaceful. My hosts are so kind and well-disposed toward me that there is nothing whatsoever to complain about. Yes, and I myself am far from complaining. Where today, par le temps qui courant, could one find a better place to live? Even simply to live independently in Tehran would be more difficult for me. And beyond everything else, I spend very little because I am living at the Marlings' expense, and even my horse is maintained on government funds. I thank the Lord God every minute for his mercy! Of course, I personally hope with my whole soul that I will end up finishing this book in any other place but Persia. Okay, interesting stuff. So he at this point, he wanted to go back. Earlier, he had not wanted to go back. He'd explicitly written to his father that he had not wanted to go back. He was afraid, even he expressed fear in one of his letters to his father that if Paul kept pushing Nicholas about it, Nicholas would say, well, fine then. Persia doesn't suit him. I'll send him to Siberia. But he also didn't want to go back and be, under house arrest, probably in Usovo. So anyway, now he wants to go back. The revolution has happened. He'd been trying to get back by writing himself, by contacting Kerensky himself, but that hadn't worked out. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that it was Felix Yusupov who probably saved his life in that respect, because if he had gone back to Russia, he almost certainly would have shared the fate of his father and other family members. But Yusupov talked him out of it, apparently, and said, look, don't come back. Things are not stable in Russia and not good. Mind you, this was before, as I mentioned yesterday, this was before the Bolshevik Revolution. This was when the provisional government was in place, and Kerensky was well disposed to Dmitri, and Dmitri was well disposed to Kerensky. But, Yusupov was a smart guy, and he saw the writing on the wall and that it was too risky, apparently. So he talked Dmitri out of it. And I have one of Dmitri's letters to Yusupov. I have to try and find that written at this time, confirming this. Okay, so not surprising that everything seems rather abstract and unreal to him. That has been my experience when I'm abroad. Even though, even in an age like ours, when you're so immediately connected to everything that happens, there's still, especially when I'm at Shatso, up in the empty hotel during the off-season in Davos, it just seems like the rest of the world is kind of unreal. So that rings very true to me. Then it's interesting that he lists these 3 options for what he might end up doing by the time he's finished with this particular diary volume. probably in between 2 or 3 months, and that would, so what are the three things that he brings up? Well, he could still be in Tehran with the Marlings. He could be at the front. He could be recalled to duty by Baratov and be with one of the regiments fighting the Turks. We know that didn't happen, even though he later claimed it did, but that was one possibility. The reason he had been dismissed in the first place was because Baratov had determined that his presence was a danger, both to himself and to the other officers, because the troops were increasingly agitated, seeing what was going on with the revolution in Russia. And they'd already started calling Dmitri Captain Romanov instead of Imperial Highness. Okay, I covered that yesterday. The other possibility was being back in Russia. You know, Nicholas had abdicated, and yeah, you know, that was what Yusupov had so far talked him out of. All right, and then, you know, there's no reason to doubt that he realized completely how absolutely lucky he was to have stumbled into this ideal situation. I mean, here he was, and he had these people who were supporting him, not only financially, but emotionally. They were so good to him. They treated him like a son. And kind of funny that he's living at the expense, more or less, of the British government. I mean, I'm sure the Marlings were paying for some things. And you know, that brings up the question, doesn't it, of what was in it for them. And I think it truly was from the goodness of their hearts. But I don't know that it would have been possible, or if it ever would have taken place to begin with before they became very fond of him, if there hadn't been an element to it of intelligence gathering. I mean, Dmitri was being visited constantly by Russians who were crossing the border into Persia, back and forth. And he was in touch with the Russian officers who were part of the what was it called? The Persian Cossack Division. He would have been just a wealth of information for Sir Charles Marling and the British legation. And, you know, India was ground zero, of course, of the Great Game, which was no longer really, you know, since the war started, and after the war started, it would not be the same, although that whole region would still be fought over. Mesopotamia, Afghanistan, Iran, all of that was ground zero for the Great Game, the rivalry between Russia and Britain for territory. And so the fact that there was this sort of really uneasy truce in Persia at that time, the country had been divided amongst colonial powers. There was still a Shah, there was still a royal family, but the British controlled the south, the Russians controlled the north, and you had an international gendarmerie. You had the Swedish gendarmes there to keep the peace. They wanted gendarmes from a neutral country. And then you had the Persian Cossack Division, all Russian officers, all Persian what's the word, troopers. But this, like I said, this was really kind of ground zero for the Great Game, and having Dmitri with them in the British legation was, you know, it had its convenient side beyond just being humanly the right thing for them to do to help him. All right, and you know, even with that, I think Sir Charles, his willingness to go above and beyond helping Dmitri, I think actually had a detrimental effect on his career. I mean, he was telling the British government that Dmitri was without fail going to be the next emperor of Russia. And so, you know, that's an interesting conversation that you can find in the in the records, in the what is it called? down by Kew, there's an archive that has government records, and you can find this conversation between the Foreign Office and Sir Charles Marling about Dmitri. But anyway, I am rambling. We have the question of how religious was he? He says, I thank the Lord God every minute for his mercy, exclamation point, and I think that was quite sincere. Even though his, religious beliefs were somewhat esoteric, he still considered himself a faithful Orthodox Christian. Although this was a time period, and that's something we won't do, but there's an alternate diary to this one for 1917, and in the alternate diary, that was set apart by Dmitri to make all his notes about his explorations of Eastern religion, esoteric religion. Anyway, what do we have next time? Well, and the question of why he was so optimistic. Now, I mentioned yesterday that the first 4 books of 1917 have been lost. They no longer exist. But he tells us that he was very optimistic right up until the time of writing this, that he would be returning to Russia soon. And one of the reasons, of course, was his contact with Kerensky, but the other reason was an anti-Kerensky thing. It was the Kornilov movement. So an attempt by the military, led by General Kornilov, to take over from the provisional government. And yeah, we're going to hear him talk quite a lot about that. And it was a very, very crucial. It may have weakened the Kornilov mutiny or movement did not succeed, but it may have weakened the Kerensky government sufficiently to have created the opportunity for the Bolsheviks to come in. I'm not an expert on that, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But anyway, next time we are going to hear Dmitri talking about Kerensky and Kornilov. So crucial stuff. So do come back, and I'll see you then. Bye.